Donald Trump wants Americans to believe his pressure campaign against Canada is strength. But the record in front of us shows something much messier. A trade relationship already governed by an agreement, Canadian leaders openly questioning whether Washington can be trusted to honor it, and a president answering that rupture by suggesting Canada wants the benefits of being an American state. That is not a small diplomatic insult. It goes directly to the credibility of the United States with one of its closest economic partners. And the question we need to answer is simple. Is this confrontation producing leverage for Washington, or is it convincing Canada that dependence on the United States has become a strategic liability? Start with the statement that triggered the latest round. At 1:06 in the morning, Trump posted that Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one, while also accusing Canada of imposing massive tariffs on American farmers. Put aside the rhetoric for a moment and focus on the contradiction. Canada and the United States already have a negotiated trade framework, CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. The Canadian argument presented in this record is not that there should be no rules, it is that Washington should follow the rules it already negotiated. That matters because Prime Minister Mark Carney's public response was not framed as a request for special treatment. He said Canada had stood by its agreements and described the new American tariffs as unjustified under the existing deal. He specifically pointed to arrangements involving steel, aluminum, and autos, arguing that those commitments were being violated. Whether every Canadian legal interpretation would survive a formal trade dispute is a separate question, but politically, the message is unmistakable. Ottawa is presenting itself as the party defending the agreement, while Washington is presented as the party changing the terms, and that gives us our first real payoff. The central dispute is not simply about whether Canada has protectionist policies or whether the United States has legitimate complaints. It is about reliability. If a government signs an agreement and then repeatedly changes the conditions under which it will honor that agreement, the other side begins pricing political risk into every future negotiation. That is exactly what Canadian leaders are now saying in public. Look at the range of voices. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew said history would not be kind to Trump and argued that Canada should not appease him. British Columbia Premier David Eby went further on the long-term consequence. His point was that even if a future change in Washington produces more stability, the old relationship is not simply coming back. Canada, he argued, now has to diversify trade so it cannot be held hostage by the depth of its integration with the American economy. Those are center-left political figures, so the obvious defense from Trump's side would be that this is partisan hostility dressed up as economic analysis. Then, Ontario Premier Doug Ford complicates that defense. Ford is a conservative, and his criticism was not subtle. He said Trump cannot be trusted because he changes deals and moves the goalposts. When politicians from competing Canadian parties converge on the same strategic concern, that does not prove every accusation they make. But it does weaken the idea that this is merely one ideological faction manufacturing outrage. So here is the first reflection worth sitting with. If an allies left and right disagree on plenty at home but increasingly agree that American commitments are unreliable, how much of that can Washington dismiss as partisan theater before it becomes a strategic fact? Now go back to Carney, because his description of the failed talks reveals another layer. He emphasized that the Canadian negotiating team was unified, that cabinet members and senior officials knew the objectives, and that responsibility ultimately rested with him and the cabinet. Then he contrasted that with the American administration, suggesting internal differences on the US side became visible as negotiators drilled into specific issues. We should be careful here. That is Carney's account. The source material does not give us internal American documents proving exactly who disagreed with whom or how those disagreements affected the final negotiation. So we cannot turn his description into established fact, but we can test what it means politically. A foreign leader is publicly saying the problem was not simply that Canada rejected American demands. He is saying the United States itself could not provide the consistency necessary for a durable agreement. Carney made that point directly when asked whether the United States could still be trusted. His answer was essentially that a country has to stand by the deals it executes. He contrasted the American approach with Canada's effort to expand trade agreements elsewhere, arguing that Canada can attract partners because it is trusted and reliable. Again, that is advocacy from the Canadian Prime Minister, not an independent verdict, but it tells us what Ottawa believes its strategic opportunity is. Convert uncertainty in Washington into an argument for diversification, and notice the information problem for the viewer. If you only see Trump's post, you get one frame. Canada is taking advantage of the United States while demanding state-like benefits. If you only hear Canadian officials, you get the opposite frame. Canada is simply defending a signed agreement against an unreliable administration. Neither frame by itself settles the legal and economic details. The disciplined move is to isolate the claims, identify the agreement both sides are invoking, and separate documented terms from political packaging. That distinction matters because the cost of repeating an overstated claim does not stay with the politician who packaged it. It lands on the person who repeats it and then discovers the missing context. Don't get played. The evidence discipline for American politics is a complete, ready-to-use verification system for catching that gap before you react. It gives you a method for tracing a political claim back to the underlying record. This is reusable for the next clip, poll, filing, statistic, or narrative. The complete digital ebook is only $9 one time. Open the description and click the first link now. The same link is in the first pinned comment. Because the next part of this record tests whether the economic pressure itself is producing the result Washington claims. The source material tries to connect the Canada dispute to a much wider economic crisis, especially energy prices and the Strait of Hormuz. Here we need to slow down and separate what is asserted from what is demonstrated. The material cites Trump claiming that more than 1,000 ships had been escorted through the Strait of Hormuz. It also cites reporting attributed to 3 U.S. officials claiming that around 40 tankers and roughly 16 million barrels of oil moved through a southern channel on a Friday night. Those are claims. The material also argues that satellite imagery and market prices contradict them, and it accuses the administration of manipulating markets. But the record we were given does not include the underlying satellite imagery, shipping database, methodology, or an independent audit of those tanker movements. That means we cannot responsibly jump from the numbers are disputed to the numbers are fabricated. The strongest conclusion supported by this material is narrower. The administration's claims are being challenged, and the evidence necessary to independently settle that dispute is not actually included here. So the fair test is not whether a high diesel price automatically proves the administration lied. It does not. The fair test is whether the administration has provided enough transparent, independently checkable information to justify the certainty of its public claims. Based on the material in front of us, that remains unresolved. The stronger middle finding, then, is not the dramatic accusation that every tanker number is fake. It is that the public argument appears to be operating with incompatible claims and insufficient shared evidence. The administration says traffic is moving at extraordinary levels. Critics point to prices, alleged shortages, and visible shipping patterns. Yet the material does not give us the independent dataset needed to reconcile those claims. That is precisely the moment when an evidence-driven viewer should become less certain, not more. What standards should apply here? If an administration makes a precise claim about strategic shipping during a war, should the public accept it because officials say it is true, or should the government provide enough verifiable information for independent analysts to test it without compromising operational security? The strongest defense of Trump is straightforward. The United States is the larger economy. Canada depends heavily on access to the American market. Aggressive bargaining can create short-term disruption while still producing a better deal later. Presidents are allowed to threaten tariffs, reject proposals, and push allies harder than previous administrations did. A failed negotiation on one day does not prove the strategy has failed permanently. That defense deserves to be taken seriously. Power asymmetry is real. Negotiations often look ugly before they close, and Canadian leaders have their own political incentives to sound defiant rather than appear to surrender to Washington. But here's the test that defense still has to pass. Leverage is only useful if it changes the other side's behavior in the direction you want. If Canadian governments respond by diversifying trade, reducing exposure to the U.S. economy, and treating American commitments as temporary, then raw economic power may be producing strategic distance rather than durable concessions. We do not yet know which outcome will dominate. The source does not give us a final agreement, a complete tariff schedule, or enough independent economic modeling to calculate the long-term cost. That uncertainty matters. Anyone claiming today that Canada has already won the entire trade war is getting ahead of the evidence. Anyone claiming the American strategy is already a clear success has the same problem. But we can identify what has already changed. Canadian leaders are openly discussing a relationship with the United States that will not simply return return to its previous form. They are talking about diversification as a necessity rather than a slogan. A conservative premier is publicly calling the American president untrustworthy, and the Prime Minister is framing reliability itself as a Canadian competitive advantage. That is not the outcome you would normally advertise as evidence that an ally has been brought closer to your position. There is also a democratic accountability question inside all of this. Trade policy can feel abstract until the costs arrive in ordinary decisions. Fuel, groceries, manufacturing inputs, investment plans, jobs tied to cross border supply chains. If those costs are being imposed to achieve a strategic objective, the public should be able to identify the objective and measure progress toward it. Otherwise, toughness becomes impossible to audit. Every cost can be called necessary, every setback temporary, and every criticism disloyal. Reverse the parties for a moment. If a Democratic president signed a North American trade agreement, later imposed new tariffs, publicly joked about absorbing Canada, and then watched conservative Canadian leaders call the United States unreliable, would Republicans accept this is just negotiating as a complete explanation? The standard should not change with the name on the podium. So return to the question we started with. Is the confrontation with Canada producing leverage, or is it teaching Canada to treat dependence on the United States as a liability? The evidence in this record cannot give us the final economic verdict. The trade conflict is still developing, important factual disputes remain unresolved, and several claims in the source require independent verification. What it does establish is a political shift that Washington cannot dismiss. Canada's Prime Minister is publicly arguing that the United States is violating existing commitments. Provincial leaders from different ideological camps are converging on distrust of Trump's negotiating approach. Canadian officials are openly discussing diversification not as a distant aspiration, but as a response to present American pressure. And Trump's answer, at least in the post at the center of this story, was to frame Canada as wanting state-like benefits. That is the contradiction. The administration wants pressure to demonstrate American power, but power that persuades an ally to build permanent alternatives can become self-defeating. The measure of success is not whether Washington can inflict pain today. It is whether the United States emerges with better terms, stronger credibility, and relationships that still work tomorrow. Another political clip, tariff claim, official statement, or accusation will soon ask you to decide what you believe before you have the full record. Without a method, somebody else chooses the frame, and you carry the credibility cost if the missing context appears later. Don't Get Played gives you a complete practical method for finding that missing context and building conclusions you can defend across clips, polls, filings, statistics, official statements, and synthetic media. The digital ebook costs only $9 as a one-time payment. Open the description and click the first link now. The same link is in the first pinned comment. A political reaction is easy. A defensible conclusion requires evidence.